the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. Reinvigorating gender equality in the 21st century.
The topic is, to me, so important, particularly on today, as Lori mentioned, but always. It actually, in my 25 to 30 years of studying criminal justice reform, about every 5 years there's a conference or a workshop on women issues. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen very often, and the fact that the Clayman Institute chose to devote their resources, I think, is important. It receives very little attention from the scholarly or the advocacy community. And I guess at the outset, the thing that drives me is that we should remember that in all areas of life like this, gender matters. And it matters in the criminal justice system, just as it matters in education, employment, etc. So if we keep in mind today, as we're going to go through our speakers, that gender matters, women are different in the criminal justice system than men. You know, most importantly, women are different because of the kinds of crimes they commit and what we call their pathways into crime. Women tend to be nonviolent. They tend to be arrested for drugs and property crime. They tend to have different pathways. 60% of females involved in the criminal justice system have been physically or mentally abused, both as children and as spouses. So their assault experiences, their mental health difficulties, they're all quite different than a man's. And it's also interesting that partly the reason we pay so little attention to women's issues is because they're such a small proportion of the criminal justice system. In the nation, about 7 to 8% of all prisoners are women. In fact, we had a running joke with many of my colleagues that if we wanted to drive the crime rate down, we would try to teach men how to behave more like women, because women are half of the U.S. population and yet only 7% of the prison population. Men are half of the U.S. population and they're 93% of the prison population. So women generally are doing something right. That kind of is a two-edged sword, though. Because they're such a small percent of the U.S. prison population, they don't get the attention, both in programs, policy, practice, advocacy, that other groups do. But if we recognize, and if I suspect that you share with me, and we're going to hear from our panelists, the notion that gender matters and that women are different, you'd have to take that seriously as we design programs for their reentry and for their in-prison care. We don't have gender-specific programs for the most part in prisons. I chaired Governor Schwarzenegger's rehabilitation panel for 3 years that brought in national experts. It was quite a large effort for the state of California. And I can tell you that probably less than 5% of my effort went to female issues. 95% of my effort went to what are we going to do about the male prisoners. This issue really is quite troublesome in many ways from a policy perspective. And when, as chairing that panel, when we testified before the legislature, several of the legislative staff and staffers and legislators themselves asked, are you asking for different treatment for women? How is that, when in fact women have fought for equality all these years? Are you now saying that in the criminal justice system you want inequality? I think it's an issue we should talk about in our discussion section as we're going to have question and answer. Is that what we're asking for here? A type of difference of treatment in recognizing that they are difference in needs and difference in crime seriousness? In some ways, people would argue that that's going back. But treating them similarly is how we've now gotten into this huge rise of women in prison. We have just a fabulous panel here today. They're going to talk to you from real on-the-ground experience. Two of our panelists have been incarcerated in their lifetimes. They've come out, they've changed for others, they've changed for not only themselves, but advocacy on behalf of all women prisoners getting out.
You know, when I speak and I say I'm talking about the 70% of women are low level, you know, for low level crimes, crimes of drugs, crimes of property. So when I say I'm speaking about all of those women who made the rise in the prison population of women go up so high over the last 20, 25 years. So I'm going to go back and say a little bit about how I ended up in prison. I had a young son, 5 years old. He was accidentally killed by a police officer, and I drank, and that was in the beginning of the war on drugs. Drugs was on every corner, and that's how I dealt with my grief, alcohol and drugs. Drugs being illegal, I was arrested, and I was sent to prison. I was sent to prison not one time for possession of drugs, but 6 times. Not once did a judge say, you have a problem that could be addressed with treatment. You have a medical problem. It was go to jail, get chained up, put on a bus, drove off in the morning, the dark of the morning, down the highway to some place, and chained along with a lot of other women just like me, and go to prison. And this was a cycle for over 15 years, going back and forth to prison until I found help with my addiction. With the addiction help came help with the grief and a lot of healing that took place in my life. And I thought, this is so much more humane, so much more useful. Why didn't it happen before? And how can I help all the other women that I knew, maybe a few different experiences, but the result of being addicted and imprisoned. And I worked for a little while and started a new way of life. And when I started a new way of life, I bought a little house, and we were all living in together. We created community and a place of healing, a place of mutual support. It was, you know, we were commonly helping each other, and it was great. It was beautiful. But I walked into a world where I discovered that this problem was so deeply ingrained in our society that anything that went wrong with anyone, the solution for it was to cage them up, incarcerate them, treat them like animals, and then spit them out, eject them back into the community ill-prepared. There's something really, really wrong in our world that we allow this type of tool to be used in our communities. There has to be, I believe, a huge shift in our frame of thinking about what has to happen. A huge, 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 spectacular form of resistance, real radical form of resistance. I would say that our whole criminal justice system should be dismantled and recreated. What we're doing is not going to dismantle it, but maybe it'll lead up to it. But there has to be a huge shift in the way we think about people, women, poor women, women of color. And that shift has to take place with you and I, and just ripple out.
I want to talk mostly about this book, and the reason why we did it is largely what Susan was saying, is that we wanted to start bringing on that sea change, bringing on people seeing who is held inside our nation's prisons. And we wanted to highlight the abuses that women in prison face on a daily basis. And as Joan said, even though the population has skyrocketed, we don't really talk about that. And it's for all the reasons that's been mentioned, you know, the increased prosecution of drug offenses and other low-level survival property crimes, the dismantling of our nation's mental health care system, the absence of real drug rehabilitation, general trend towards imposing long prison sentences, right? And so right now what we're looking at is the reality is that over the last 30 years, the population of in women's prisons has increased by 8 times. So, and then same point, the men's population has increased, but only by 400%, right? So it's 400% versus 800%. And so we really wanted to take that moment. And the other piece was sort of the larger moment, especially at Justice Now, which is where I work, which is another legal services organization working with women inside California prisons. We want to take this opportunity to give the women the voice and the moment to share their whole lives, right? What their lives was before they came to prison, what brought them to prison, the human rights abuses they experienced in prison, and then when we could, sort of where they came out the other side after prison, or, you know, in terms of what they're still inside, where they are right now. One thing I wanted to jump on is childhood sexual abuse. No one was selected because of their experience of childhood sexual abuse, but it was far higher than the 2/3 or 3/4 number that's quoted. And those are people who actually admitted it to an interviewer, right? So we're talking, the number was huge, and just so deadening reading the story after story of childhood sexual abuse that was not addressed and leading to self-medication, right? And we saw so many cases of that, and it was really powerful in there. The biggest area, obviously, healthcare abuses, including reproductive rights. We can talk about that in the question and answer. There was also, of course, sexual abuse, which is very, very prevalent. And that was one that differed the most state by state. Healthcare across the board, terrible in all situations, not much of a difference. Sexual abuse, you could see we're actually making it clear that it's not okay to treat women inside as your own sexual property made a difference. So we did see that was someplace where there was up and down. Obviously, termination of parental rights and general separation from your family was woven through many, many of the narratives. We only were able to have one that focused on it because of the way that the law plays out. Once you get your parental rights terminated, the appeal process is not really going to happen in most cases. And so it was very difficult to capture, to find any of those women because they were sort of lost to the system. And whereas sexual abuse and some of the other stuff, they might try to maintain their relationships.
The subject of today's discussion, women prisoners, no right to be a mother, I want to really say, and I hope everyone hears this, I never once felt like I didn't have a right to be a mother. I always felt like I had a right to be a mother. And I knew what I needed, and luckily I got it, was the love and support and the commitment from family members and people that were working in advocacy on the outside to help support me on the inside. If I didn't have that, if I hadn't have had that, I don't know how I would have come out. I know I would not have come out whole. We need partnerships and coalitions to continue any kind of work that will create change. We have to work together.
The Supreme Court ruled last May of 2011 that California's prisons were so overcrowded that they violated the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, cruel and unusual punishment, particularly that people in California prisons could not access medical care and mental health care because that the situation had become so crowded. So it wasn't that actually, we had a couple of options in California. The Supreme Court ruled that we had to bring the prisons down to 137% of design capacity, which meant in our system, we had to bring the prison system down from about 165,000 prisoners to about 135,000 prisoners. So we're trying to get 30,000 out. And that's how we're doing it. We're not going to return parole violators. We also aren't going to, only people going to prison after October 1st will be violent, serious, or sex offenders, and everybody else has to be handled in the local jail system. So just in the first 4 months, we brought the prison population down 10,000 people.
I urge you, just like Susan did, that when you reflect on this, to remember the voices of the women and wonder, are we serving them, their families, their communities, right, best by locking them up, right, and destroying their families and forcing them to experience further abuse? Or is there a better way? Can we channel money into communities instead of prisons, right? Can we provide real drug rehab instead of incarceration? And can we provide therapy and support for childhood sexual abuse instead of forcing people to self-medicate and with drugs, alcohol, and more abusive relationships? And, you know, can we have real educational systems and family support instead of letting people get broken by life and then throwing them away in prison?